Thank you for inviting me to this event, and I think it shows you the real interest people have in both this issue, but also on how the UK is both divergent but similar. And I just wanted to start by reflecting on what Richard said, because it's very much what is happening in Scotland is happening across the rest of the UK. And Alison will remember that I've been banging on since at least 2010 in Parliament that the infectiousness of Scottish nationalism and populism will infect the rest of the UK. And I think Brexit shows us that when nationalism does infect, you end up with politicians who will say anything, do anything, and be anything to get what they want. And this isn't just a thing for the UK, of course. We've seen that in the States, and hopefully we're now coming out of the end of that in the States, at least politically, with Joe Biden winning the presidential election. I suppose you could argue we're seeing it in France, and there was an opinion poll just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, showing that almost neck and neck between Macron and Le Pen. And of course, Macron's a product of that populism that happened in France. We've seen it all across democracies. So whilst the UK is very different, it's also very similar to where other people are. And just on the thing around Englishness, Britishness, Scottishness, Europeanness, identity, in a Scottish context at the moment, Scottishness now swamps absolutely everything. It never did before. People were very comfortable being Scottish and British and European. Now it's Scottishness and nothing else. It's history, culture, education. The only connection between Scotland now and Britishness is there a connection between the northeast and the northwest of England. So the irony of that being, of course, that all the social attitude survey shows that Scotland as a nation is very, very similar to London in its attitudes to the NHS, public policy, politics, etc., etc., etc. So there is some contradictions in all of this, and I think those contradictions were laid out by Richard and the other speakers. In the Scottish context, though, and I'm going to be quite brutal about this. I campaigned to stay in the EU. My own constituency ended up with a 78% Remain vote. Hopefully, I can probably claim that was partly the kind of campaign that we ran. And we've ended up in a situation now where all of those arguments about Brexit, all of those spurious arguments about Brexit, take back control, sovereignty, easiest trade deals in history, frictionless trade, no non-tariff barriers, we'll still trade with them, they're our friends, it won't affect our economy, etc., etc., etc. All the things that everybody on this knows were completely spurious and lies, including the magical £350 million in the bus, are exactly the same arguments that the nationalists in Scotland are using for Scottish independence. So the danger is that we all abhor Brexit so much that we talk the country into a Skexit, we talk the country into Irish reunification, and we talk the country into essentially the breaking up of the United Kingdom Union on the back of the breakup of the European Union. So I really I do just warn against that, because I read people in the chat, and I do a lot of these kinds of talks where people go, let Scotland go, let it rejoin the EU, and that'll be completely wonderful. Well, it won't, because it won't be wonderful for Scots. And it won't be wonderful for the rest of the United Kingdom, because it's Brexit with bells on. And there was a report produced by the London School of Economics today, that was released today, that showed that Scotland going down the road of independence would be 3 or 4 times worse and more impactful on its economy than the UK leaving the EU. So we need to be quite careful that we don't, as people who are Scottish or British or both or Europeans, are so angry about Brexit that we talk other parts of the United Kingdom into some kind of inevitability to do with Skexit or otherwise, including the reunification of Ireland that Stuart so eloquently talked about in his contribution. So how do we resolve this problem when we're so sore about what's happened with regards to our position in the European Union? When people say to me, are you a nationalist? The answer is always no. I'm a patriot, and you can be both. You can be a patriot and a nationalist, but you can also be a patriot without being a nationalist, and that's really quite important. Alison's patriotic about Merseyside. She's patriotic about Liverpool Football Club. She's patriotic about politics, because these are the kinds of identities that we live our lives through, because we all have our interests and because we all have the things that we care about. when Scotland play England in the European Championships at Wembley in July, nobody will be dancing in the streets more than me if we stuff the English by 5-0. Now, that's patriotism. It's not nationalism. And we have to be very careful that we don't mix up the two things. So how do we then do it? Well, the answer then becomes, then what does the United Kingdom look like in a post-Brexit world? I think the debate about rejoining the EU is a long way off. It might be a generation off, it might be less than that, who knows? The mess is starting to, the reality is now bashing up against what we were promised, and that may unfold in future. But that is down the tracks, whether we like that or not. So at this moment in time, we have to look at how we would look at the United Kingdom in a post-Brexit Britain. How do we get powers out of Westminster and into local communities? How do we make sure that the successes of devolution that we've had in Wales, Scotland, the Metro Mayors in London, and you could argue the Good Friday Agreement and the devolution in Northern Ireland, how do we build on that in the mid-2020s? And the way we build on that in the mid-2020s is to give much more accountability, responsibility, and critically the money to the areas to make their own decisions. Now, that's not nationalism. That is about the redistribution in a devolution sense. And the critical thing here, and Alison mentioned this, it's also got to be about redistribution. Because politicians like myself and Alison in the Labour movement believe in redistribution. What we cannot afford in this whole debate is for us to end up with a regional nationalism where everyone goes, or London goes, mainly in the southeast, and in the Scottish context, Edinburgh, and arguably Aberdeen, or Glasgow goes, we raise the money, so we'll keep it, thank you very much. And then you get a much more disintegration of the political, social, and cultural union across the United Kingdom. So there's a huge number of really big issues that have to be addressed now in terms of the governance that have been brought to light because of Brexit. And I would just say this, here is where some of the contradictions come in, and maybe why some people think that independence for Scotland is attractive as a result of Brexit. The whole issue then becomes, where does Scotland lie economically, culturally, and socially as part of the United Kingdom if it was to leave? The very Brexit deal that we all abhor and think is dreadful and is thin, and Boris is, I think the words that Stuart used, cobbled together at the last minute, is the very relationship that Scotland would have with the rest of the United Kingdom. And that's the relationship the rest of the United Kingdom would have with Scotland. It's disastrous economically, because it's disastrous for the UK. And therefore, we should be looking at this on the basis of what should we do in the context of how the United Kingdom works in a post-Brexit Britain that is beneficial for the people that live in Scotland and live in the rest of the United Kingdom. That's the question we need to answer. And the answer to that question can't be, we should make matters worse because we're sore about Brexit. So I'll leave it there, Mary, so we can get some questions in some of the debate.